Hello and welcome to this course, How to Lead Virtual Teams. My name is Doug Gray, and I'm not sure, today's March 18th, I'm not sure if St. Patrick's Day even happened yesterday anywhere in the world. As you all know, the coronavirus has forced all of us to use virtual tools, and teams are critical as we continue to do our work together. To be clear, there's a bunch of different perspectives on this. One is that we've had virtual teams as long as we've had recorded history. We've always had a fiat from a king or some leader that was distributed to some dislocated or remote team, and then they did or didn't do that. But I think we've got a compelling argument for a lot of more significant changes. In fact, and I think it's important to start with a couple of definitions. So multicultural is the awareness and acceptance of different racial, social, ethnic, and interest groups. We all say that we're multicultural on good days, and we've all got multicultural biases, which prevent us from having an open heart and open eyes to a certain person from a certain racial group, social group, ethnic group. Communication is how we exchange information. That old triangle of a sender and a message and receiver is pretty well understood, I think, at an intuitive level, but we're not always intentional. So I want us to be intentional in this last conversation. Let's imagine you say, or you've got a market demand for inclusive workforce. What does that mean? Does it mean you look at gender and education, military service, office locations, lines of business, disabilities? What are the variables that are really important in your virtual team? I don't think we're often intentional enough. We know the research is compelling. Publicly traded companies that have women on the boards, or 30% or more women on the boards, are much more effective than single gender, typically all male boards. Boards with, in publicly traded companies, diversity, social diversity, racial, ethnic, cultural diversity, and expertise in different sectors outperform those that are more uniform. We know also Pew is a great resource for all these research studies on data and variability over time by generations. So smartphones, who owns them, who uses a tablet, who uses social media, is a fairly easy thing to track. And as a virtual leader, you might choose to maybe attract new hires in a certain tool and not another tool for a compelling reason. You might go to LinkedIn if you're a professional services firm. You might go to Facebook if you're looking for people to work in your restaurant. Social media usage also varies tremendously. Here's 4 or 5 examples: Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, YouTube, and Twitter. So in order to attract people, you've got to go to the place where they use digital tools, especially if you want to foster the certain kind of diversity. And when you look at demographic changes, here's the US, but it could be any country, this is likely to change over time, just as some of the political concerns now about the next election have looked at demographic changes in certain geographies. We know that each of those geographies represents sometimes similar needs. For instance, that the Hispanic vote has, or Hispanic population has. Well, thankfully, there's more of a voice. But what does that mean in virtual teams? You've got maybe a thing called a cultural intelligence metric. It could be that you train for cultural bias. It's the case that Starbucks, last year, decided we're going to reduce cultural bias for 4 hours. We're going to provide and mandate training to all of our employees in every country. Well, what's the real value of that? It had some possibly had some value for reducing bias of their associates. But the biggest value was to increase, it's a marketing tool, to increase the perception that Starbucks is on top of cultural bias in a different way than another coffee shop or another company, that they're more woke. If you go to Seattle, people talk about being more woke or socially aware or multiculturally savvy than others. This is also a cultural intelligence metric that you can track within your career. It could be that you intentionally promote women, or you intentionally promote a certain ethnic group because there's a market need for doing so. There are companies that do that, and it's sometimes overt. Sometimes they'll say we intend to have 60 or 70% of our managers promoted internally. Why? Because it fosters goodwill, and they're consistent with the history of that company. Flip it around. If you had a company that said, no, we're only going to bring in senior managers for these positions, and 60 or 70% of our hires are going to be from external companies or organizations, that demotivates that group. So let's imagine one of your competencies that you just picked was multicultural activity, and you want to foster it. So you got to measure those biases, which are trackable, and you've got to measure how to decrease them in your work world. There are lots of validated assessments that do this. One is pretty common, organizational culture assessment, OCAI. I often use a competing culture values framework. There are many, and just ask a business psychologist or turn to